What's up everyone, welcome to our shop rebuilding. Today's episode I'll share with you guys all the parts laid out on the white table which came off the John Deere 400 garden tractor. Some of the parts have a little bit of damage, some of the parts have major damage, and some of the parts are just on the table so you guys have a better understanding of how they function and work. So stick around as I share with you guys all the parts on this table. I'm going to start on the far left of this white table. The first assembly or sub-assembly I will be focusing on is the front PTO and the rear PTO. The front PTO and the rear PTO are exactly the same. This whole sub-assembly is mounted on the front axle. So this pin right here, what you're seeing is the pin for the front axle. Your front axle will pivot right on here. So it'll go left and right. And then within this pin, which is stationary, and this is hooked up to the frame of the John Deere 400, we have a bore. This bore will accommodate our front and our rear PTO shaft. Up front, you guys will see a radial ball bearing. This is sealed on both sides. I will give you guys on screen the details on this radial bearing right here so you guys can purchase this. You will also find the purchase links down below in the description. On the rear of this bore, we have a Torrington seal, which seals off the needle bearing within this pin. Further off to the right, I have found some parts on this machine which need to be completely replaced. These are some of the parts that are damaged too far where I will not be able to rebuild them myself. If I would need special tools, which I do not have. So we have the female and the male rod ends. These come off the tie rod, and these right here come off the steering cylinder. So on the steering, since this machine had around 1,000 hours, there is not too much wear, but there is excess wear. So there is too much wear on the female rod end, and that's not good for my liking. I could just keep them and wear them down completely, but I do not like them. So these two female rod ends are worn, and I will purchase new ones very soon. The male rod ends are a little bit harder to see. There is too much play within this elbow and the joint right here. So I will be replacing the male and the female rod ends. For me, they just have too much play. This one even has a little bit of damage, so I do not have the proper tools. I would machine them down to size or even make some myself. I just do not have the proper tools at the moment. So I will go ahead and replace these very soon. So before I get to the steering assembly in the middle of the table, I'd like to get some feedback from you guys. Leave a comment down below what you guys would like to see on the John Deere 400. I will be doing a rebuild on most of the parts. I have a whole bunch of parts laid out right now, which I will be introducing to you guys. I will be putting them back together in today's video, and I will also be sharing with you guys information about them. If you guys are interested in other sub-assemblies or bigger or larger assemblies in general, leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to cover that topic in an upcoming video. So without further ado, let me share with you guys the steering assembly. This right here is the steering assembly. It is already disassembled. It's not very hard to disassemble, so I will go through the parts right now on the table. Right here we have the steering shaft, which is hooked up to a steering worm gear. The steering shaft is mounted within the steering column, which runs down to here, and on the very bottom we have our steering gearbox. The worm gear lies within the steering gearbox, and the mechanism that allows the steering to pivot on the worm gear is this plate right here with an adjustable set screw, which allows you to adjust the depth of the set screw, and this set screw will eventually go into the worm gear. Onto the right side we have a wear plate, and we have a little gasket. This is a very cheap gasket, nothing too particular. This gasket right here acts as a washer or a damper for this wear plate, so it's nothing too serious. If you guys do not have this material, you guys can find something close to it, or at least the same thickness, cut that to size and replace it. Over here we have the two lock nuts, and we have a washer which hold this plate in place. On the bottom of the screen I have two bearings. One bearing lies above the worm gear and the other is placed below the worm gear. Once everything is assembled, it will be within the housing of the steering gearbox. So I will share with you guys a close-up view on the bearings right now because I did fix a major issue. Laid out in front of me are two bearings. We have one to the left and one to the right. The right bearing is the bottom bearing on the worm gear. We have the end cap which tightens everything up in the steering gearbox. We have a spring washer. When I give you guys a close-up view, this washer is not perfectly flat. It is beveled upwards. So there is a little mark on the top end. So this was pushing up against the bearing race, which is the back side of this. And the bottom end, you will see the outside diameter has been touched, and the bigger diameter will touch the cap. The bearing race mounts on top of the washer like so, and we have the bearing ball assembly with the crown that goes on just like that. So when I share with you guys these two bearing ball assemblies, the two crowns or the bearing ball spacers are different colors. So the pink one is the original one and the black one has been 3D printed. When I started up the John Deere 400 for the first time, everything felt just fine. But then when I turned all the way to the left or all the way to the right, I noticed that the steering gearbox was kind of hesitant and jumping a little bit. So I thought there was something wrong within the steering gearbox, and that's exactly why I took it apart. This bearing crown has been 3D printed. I will give you guys a close-up view on that. You guys can still see the lines, but the print quality has turned out amazing. I will leave a link down in the description to this file in case you at home have a 3D printer and you'd like to print yourself something like this, or even something functional that will work on your John Deere 300 series or 400 series steering box. The original steering crown is just a shade different. They have these little incisions here, possibly to give it a little bit more play or a little bit more flexibility. I did not add that to mine. It is still very flexible, as you guys can see. Nothing will break. I will choose the original bearing assembly for the bottom bearing and the new crown which I printed on the top bearing. So just in case there's more load on the bottom, it will still be the original crown, and the 3D printed crown, which will have a little bit less stress, I would say, will be on the top of this steering shaft. Since I just explained to you what damage I found within the steering box and I described all the components of the steering assembly, let me just go ahead and assemble this steering assembly for you guys. Everything which is laid out on the table in the middle of the picture is for the steering assembly, and I will dry fit it and assemble it for you guys right now. The first thing I will grab is the steering shaft, and we will grab the top bearing first, which is the newly 3D printed top bearing assembly. I will put this on this way and I will slide it down the shaft. There is a slight little bump right here, so you guys have to be careful that you don't lose any of these bearing balls on the crown. The next thing I will grab is the top race, which is one race, and that will slide down there as well, and it will go right onto the bearing ball assembly. Everything should turn freely. If this does not turn freely, it is possible that your bearing race is damaged or your bearing balls are damaged. So make sure that this spins freely before you do anything. Now I'll take this shaft and add it into the steering column. I will slide it in gently, and I will make sure at the same time that the shaft comes out the top. So, and just like that, the steering shaft is within the steering gearbox and I can spin it freely. The next thing I will do is go ahead and grab the nut which actually holds the steering wheel or locks it in place, and I will just add that on here so the steering shaft does not come out anymore. The next thing I will do, I will grab the cap which threads in on the bottom of the steering gearbox. I will make sure that the washer is in the right way. You want to make sure that the washer is facing upward. Place it down in there. Grab the bearing race and place that in the cap as well, like that. And then we'll grab our bearing assembly and add that right onto there. You want to make sure that this is turning freely as well. You do not want to assemble anything which is damaged. Just installed the top bearing and the bottom bearing. Everything is in place and I can spin it freely now. You will have to add a little bit of preload and make sure that the bearings aren't too tight and not too loose on the bottom. The next thing that I will have to do is add a cotter pin directly through this bore, and I'll line it up with one of these cutouts on the bottom of the end cap. Since I'm only dry fitting this assembly for you guys, I'm not going to add the cotter pin just yet. I will continue with the other components which still have to be installed. Next up, you'll grab your pre-made gasket or the old one if it's still in good condition and lay it on top of the steering box. The next thing that you want to add is the wear plate. Put that on top just like that. Make sure everything sits properly. If it's too loose in any way, you want to make sure that nothing is bent or something in that manner. Next up, I will grab this assembly. We have the shaft and the plate, as well as our retractable or adjustable pin, which will go into our worm gear. So, since this is only a dry fit, I will not lube anything up, but I would suggest you guys fill this already up with grease. And every part which touches another metal part, I would lube up as well. So this surface can be lubed up so this plate spins on there freely and does not bind up, as well as the pin and this shaft which goes to the bore. This steering gearbox can be greased, but I would suggest you guys fill this up with grease right away. I will add this onto the steering gearbox just like so, making sure that the adjustable set screw will slide into the worm gear nicely, and I'll leave it just like that. Now I'll go ahead, hold the plate, and flip it around. The next thing I want to add is our washer that will slide down just like that. There is one nut which has a shiny surface on both sides. That means this was the bottom nut first. I will spin this on by hand. You want to make sure your threads are good. Just like that. You want to make sure that it's not too tight just by hand, so you guys can still spin this freely. That might already be a little bit too tight, but it's all adjustable. The next step would be to add the second nut once the first nut is in place. And just like that, you guys will have your steering assembly put together, obviously with grease. So the next part I will be talking about is the lift cylinder for the 3-point hitch in the rear of the John Deere 400. I don't have much to say about the lift cylinder. I'm just going to say it's completely damaged and there's no way I can fix it in this condition. I will give you guys a close-up right now so you guys understand what I'm talking about. This right here is the lift cylinder. We have the main housing, which is the left side of the picture. We have an attachment point or a pivoting point on the left of the picture. We have the piston, which is within this housing. we have the rod which protrudes out of the housing, and we have another pivot point or a bore on the far of the rod. So the main issue on this steering cylinder is the wear on both sides of this rod. This rod was loose inside of the John Deere 400. I did not activate this whatsoever. It just happens to be damaged, and this was the main leak on the rear of the John Deere 400. I will point out the damage right away, and that is wear on the side of the rod. There's a lot of wear on the tip. We have another little spot of wear, which is right here, but there's wear which follows along down the rod and ends somewhere here. That's about 3/4 of the length. Obviously, that's about even half of what it moves in and out. It's the other side of the rod, so as you guys can see, there's much more wear on this side, and you guys can really see it. That's a flat spot just all the way in the rod. Now the issue with this cylinder is it's welded shut. It is possible to open it up, but even taking that time opening it up or cutting it open, making sure it's the right length, cutting the rod off and adding new cold rolled steel on here would be just too much to do. So it's probably best to just buy a new one. It's a shame that the cylinder is welded shut. I will not throw this away just in case I want to fix that, because it's a nice size cylinder. Once the lathe is hooked up, I can obviously open that on the weld. I can just go in there with a tool, open it up, and that will be very simple. But without the proper tooling right now, I just can't manage to take that apart and put it back together the way it should be. So I have two more parts laid out on this table which I'd like to talk about. One is the rear PTO shaft, which hooks up to the rototiller. This is only the top part of the telescoping PTO shaft. I will discuss how to put this back together, but the first part I will be talking about is the disassembled pulley tensioner, which activates and deactivates your front and rear PTO on this tractor. On the top of the picture, you guys will see the PTO pulley, which is at the same time a tensioner. When I had this pulley in my hand, it was still put together like this. There are 6 spot welds around the perimeter of this pulley. So the only thing I had to do is figure out where those spot welds were and drill them out. After that, I was able to free it up and remove these 2 halves. What I then found was this bearing. This bearing was seized shut, and I couldn't even move it. Even when the pulley was in the vise, I wasn't able to move it. Right now, it is completely seized. So the best thing to do was replace this bearing. I went ahead and grabbed a Nachi Quest bearing. These Nachi bearings are radial bearings. These are manufactured in Japan. They are high quality bearings, and the bearing number of this Nachi bearing is right here. So if you guys want to purchase this bearing, if you guys want to take your time and drill out those spot welds, remove both halves, and insert a brand new bearing, I will leave the info down in the description for this bearing in case you'd like to pick it up. So right now I will insert the new bearing, and I will tie it all together with these 6 blind rivets. You want to make sure that the inside surface is perfectly clean, that the surface which will bond with the partnering surface is perfectly clean. And what I did before I removed both halves, I made sure to mark how they came apart. So this is the line which follows onto the other line, and I'm going to make sure that they go back together. It was in the beginning. The next thing I will do is I'll grab the radial bearing. I'll place it right in here, and now since it doesn't go down all the way, as you guys can see, there's still a little bit of gap right there. I'm going to make sure that this is nice and flush, and I'll go over to the press and I'll just push it in and make sure it's flush. I'm back from the press, and I lined up the bearing with 1/2 of the pulley perfectly. Everything spins freely and it's perfectly aligned. Now the next step will be to merge both halves, and for that I'm going to line up both lines like I mentioned before. And to do that, the best way is to grab 2 blind rivets and insert them into 2 opposite lying bores which you made with your drill before. If you line them up like that, you're not going to have any trouble when you push these two halves together. They're going to line up perfectly, and afterwards you can add the other 4. I merged both halves together. The bearing is seated just fine. And now we'll go ahead and tighten up the first 2 blind rivets with our riveting tool. So I finished up with the second last part on this table. This is the pulley or the tensioner. I added the new bearing. Everything spins just fine. I'm really happy that I can take apart pulleys like this and give them a second life. It really is just the bearing within the pulley that's the problem over time. Sure, your belts can wear through the pulley, but you're gonna have to be using that rototiller or your mower deck a whole bunch to really wear through that pulley. I'll share with you guys the components that are involved within the PTO shaft, which is just the top part of the PTO shaft, which leads to the rear rototiller. I will not change anything on the U-joint as it still works just fine. This U-joint right here on the drive shaft is able to accept grease, so there's not really much that can go wrong with this. Obviously you can replace these, but I will not take this one apart. I might take the ones on the drive shaft apart. So stay tuned for an upcoming video on how I'll do those U-joints. But for now, let me share with you guys the top link on the rear PTO shaft. This right here is the top part of the rear drive shaft. You guys can see the U-joint, which I will not be taking apart. Everything is just fine here. This is a square drive. This drive then transfers power to the lower part of the drive shaft that has the exact same square drive, but it is an internal square. This is telescoping, so what that means is you can adjust your bottom part of the drive shaft to a certain length, and that allows you a little bit of flexibility or range on your equipment length. This part of the drive shaft will then hook up to the gearbox, which I have over there on the ground. Another thing I will share with you guys is the shield, which every PTO shaft has. Obviously, no manufacturer wants you to get hurt or have your fingers within this U-joint. So what they have a little shield right here, and that allows a little bit of safety that you do not put your fingers within the U-joint. I will share with you guys the locking mechanism from the drive shaft to the shield. Once we install the shield, I will share with you guys the locking mechanism, which is up front, and this hooks up and locks in place onto your gearbox. For the shield, we only need the top part of the drive shaft. We need this C-clip. This does not have any tabs on it, or else it would be a snap ring. And we have this little spacer. This is, I believe, Teflon or a very hard plastic. And this happens to be broken. I did not 3D print this because my materials I have aren't this abrasive resistant or strong enough. So I will be reusing this, and there is no way that this will come apart. It can only get damaged even more, but since it's already in 2 pieces, I don't believe it will get damaged anytime soon. If it will get damaged, I will just buy a new one. But in today's video, I will be reusing this. The plastic part, which you guys see on the bottom of the screen, allows the shield to have a certain distance from the top part of the PTO shaft. When we look at the internal diameter, it is far bigger than the outside diameter of this shaft. So what the manufacturer did, they grabbed a piece of plastic, which then fits in this groove. They add that piece right there. And once you slide this on, the PTO shaft will never touch the shield, and that will allow the PTO shaft to drive centered within this shield. To lock the PTO shaft into the shield, we have this C-clip. This C-clip will get pushed into the groove down below, and the C-clip will be on this height of this cutout. So the next thing I will be doing is assembling this part of the PTO shaft. You may need a flathead screwdriver to push in that C-clip. And then after I do this, I will get to the locking mechanism of this PTO shaft. So the first thing I will do is I'll grab the C-clip, put that onto the PTO shaft, just like that. I will grab these two halves. I'll make sure they get inserted into the groove freely. My plastic part is broken, but I'll make sure it goes together the way it was. And then I'll grab the shield and I'll slowly insert this down into here. I really want to make sure that those two halves don't come apart, but it seems like it just locked into place with ease. I have the flash on right now and the C-clip is not in place yet, but I will make sure I push that in place with the flathead screwdriver right now. You want to take your flathead screwdriver and push that in place and off to one side, and that's how it'll lock in place. And then you guys want to go around the perimeter and push it in, and at the same time you guys also want to push it down. It's not the easiest thing to do, especially in front of the camera now, but I'll make that happen. And just like that, I managed to put it in with one hand. And now that's in place. That does not come out. It's perfectly in place, and that will not allow the shield to touch the drive shaft. Just like that, the drive shaft is in the middle of the shield. I finished installing the shield on the bottom end of the top PTO shaft, and now we'll go ahead and install the locking mechanism. The locking mechanism consists of 3 bearing balls which get inserted into 3 bores on this PTO shaft. These bearing balls will lock onto the spline, which is on the gearbox, and there's a sleeve which gets pushed on. Once this sleeve is on top of the bearing balls lock in place. If we pull the sleeve back, the bearing balls get freed underneath the sleeve, and you are able to pull off the PTO shaft from the spline. So for this part of the assembly, since I will be only assembling it and I will not take it apart anymore, I will grab some high quality grease. I will take my flat screwdriver and apply a little bit of grease. I don't want to add too much because I do not want this to collect too much dust. Since there's enough grease on there right now, I will grab all 3 bearing balls and I'll insert them right here. I want to make sure that all bearing balls are greased up as well, so that there's enough grease around the perimeter. And especially on top of the bearing balls as well. The next thing I will be installing is this sleeve. This sleeve has 2 ends. One end is chamfered and one end has a radius. You'll see that on this side. So the top end has a radius and the bottom end has a chamfer. The chamfered side will be facing forward on the shaft, and the radius side will be facing the back end. So we're going to slide this on right now, and hopefully it locks into place like that. It will go back and forward, and that's exactly what it has to do. Now to lock this sleeve in place, we have one more piece, and that is another C-clip. This C-clip we will add on the front of this shaft, and that will keep the sleeve in place and not allow it from falling out. And just like that, I inserted it by hand, and now when I bring that sleeve forward, there's no way that sleeve will fall out. I'll give you guys a close-up. If you guys made it this far in the video, I want to thank you a bunch. I've seen a whole bunch of comments and likes recently. Everything has been really positive, and I just want to thank you guys out there Thank you, thank you, thank you. So if you guys like this diverse video, please hit that like button down below. It helps me understand if you guys are enjoying the content I'm sharing with you guys. I am doing this for YouTube, but I hope to share a little bit of knowledge or understanding of all these sub-assemblies on the John Deere 400. It takes a lot of time to do these videos, but I'm really happy to share them with you guys because I really enjoy doing it, and I also enjoy rebuilding machines in general. So hit that like button down below if you guys enjoyed this video. But for now, I'll put these parts away and I'll clean up the white table, so in the next video you guys will have a perfect view on what I'll assemble. So stay tuned.